So when it comes to the future of masculinity's work, for me, as somebody who works across a range of different schools in the UK, talking to and engaging thousands of young people per year in conversations related to masculinity, misogyny, sexism, violence against women and girls, etc. For me, there are a few things that are particularly important that we need to think about and be attuned to when it comes to the future of masculinity work in terms of how it's positioned and delivered in schools, but also how it's communicated and disseminated across different cultural spheres. For me, I think it's really important when we're considering the future of masculinity work that we recognize and acknowledge the systemicness of what we're speaking to. First and foremost, I think that is foundational. There is a uh, palpable sense of avoidance when it comes to talking about things like patriarchy or even mentioning it in conversations or spaces in educational context, but also in cultural contexts. When you say it, it's like, oh my gosh, we're talking about this. This isn't a space to talk about this. We can't talk about this. It's a loaded term. It's divisive. It's polarizing. I don't know if we've not clocked this, but masculinity's discourse is a polarized area, right? It's something that comes with the potential and the perpetuation of polarity. We try and avoid the lenses that are useful in conversation by saying it's too much, it's too political, it's too loaded, when, in my opinion, some of the most important conversations that we have is about naming that polarization, naming that politicization, naming those influences and ideas and frames instead of avoiding them. The future of masculinity work for me cannot saturate the realities of what is occurring for young people in their space, in their echo chambers, in their cultural contexts. Because here's the thing that I've learned and observed across several different workshops, interventions that I've delivered and sort of worked with schools around the UK on, right? Young people want to talk about these things. Young people want to talk about what is important to them or what they have questions about. And feminism, patriarchy, what is it? What is it actually? And what does it mean? And where does it come from? And how is it shaped? Are questions that young people actively bring into the space. They are calibrated for those discussions. They might not always come in with a lens that is refined or critically considered, but they're young people. They're coming in with the messiness of their worldviews and what they think and how they think. And that's beautiful to contact in the context of delivery. But by avoiding the systemicness, by not naming it, we can't contextualize the pervasiveness historically and culturally, in my opinion, of misogyny, sexism, and violence against women and girls without naming that systemicness in conversation. That for me is massively important when it comes to the future of masculinity work. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that dysregulation, challenge, critique is a normal part of work with young people. It's a normal part of conversations around socially created and social constructs like gender. There is going to be friction. There is going to be conflict. And trying to avoid conflict in conversations, in my opinion, really saturates the realness of what needs to follow and what needs to be brought into the space. The future of masculinity work cannot be afraid of dysregulating young people, but in the context of my work specifically, we cannot be afraid of dysregulating young men. Not because we want to see young men suffer, but because we want to see young men, sit and ride in their seats and feel attacked, shamed, and blamed, but modeling a way through dysregulation, not a way of avoiding dysregulation, to me is massively important. Dysregulation and feeling activated is a part of human nature. Our worldviews are not always going to be aligned or in absolute sync, when it comes to what we think, what we believe. But often the underlying assumption, perhaps, in some of the spaces and ideas that I've seen over the years is that, we kind of want to create space for harmony. You can't get to harmony without recognizing and working through some dysregulation. There has to be room for that, but there has to be room for modeled, attuned dysregulation, not the shame stick, not the blame stick, not the tut-tutology of I can't believe you think this and what the heck's wrong with you. That's not helpful and useful. But modeling challenge, congruence. I'm not sure if I agree with you there. And here's why. I'd love to hear what you think about that. Tell me what you think in that space. Opening up the door for naming the activation. I can see that's, activated you a little bit. I can see that's got to you a little bit. Let's talk about it. It's important that I hear from you and your perspective because what you feel matters. naming that, working through that instead of trying to avoid it, for me is massively important when it comes to considering the future of masculinity's work. And connected to that, in my eyes, linked with that as well, is about being able to hold the critical space for young people, specifically young men, in the context of my work, to name whataboutery. Because this is something that at this point in time, and again, you know me, my opinion, my perspective, not the perspective, but a lot of masculinity's discourse right now, and by extension, conversations around misogyny, sexism, violence against women and girls, even conversations around men's mental health, often come with varying degrees of whataboutery. If, as a man, for example, facilitating a masculinity space, I mention misogyny, the instant whataboutery at this point in time is, well, what about misandry? Misandry is real too. That kickback, that reaction is useful to acknowledge and name and to explore, rather. But it's also important that we are able to name when whataboutery gets in the way of critical exploration and examination. If the go-to approach or reaction in the space is to consistently meet invitation for criticality with a, what about this? What about that? Instead of confronting what is being asked to be thought through, reflected on, considered, we should be able to name that, and we must name that. That's not about hating men. That's not about demonizing men. That's not about placing men firmly at the bottom of the list. That is about saying, I care too much about you to enable this behavior to occur in this space as much as it is. We can have the conversations that you want to be brought into the space. This is collaborative. This is communal. Right now, we're discussing this, and it's really important that we lock in on this subject for now, and then in the next session or later on in the session, however you decide to work, if you're working in the space, we can bring that up too. But the constant derailment that often occurs in spaces can and must be named, in my opinion. Because what we don't name, we can't address. What we can't address, we can't change. There is nothing wrong with naming whataboutery. But when you see whataboutery online, and maybe I might link a couple of my posts or collaborated posts with people like Bernie Bernard, someone I love and really, care for dearly in the space, and we work a lot together. See some of the comments on some of our posts about naming misogyny, sex, and violence against women and girls, and bringing and calling men in. Some of the reactions and responses to that are really illuminating, because there's a lot of whataboutery. There's a lot of whataboutery in the online spaces that consistently show up, that are consistently normalized, consistently encouraged. Yeah, and we're seeing this at increasing rates. We're seeing in many ways, again, in my opinion, the mainstreaming of whataboutery. We're getting to a point now where people are saying, we're talking about this misogyny and sexism stuff so much that I think, we're actually impacting and hindering boys. Like, we need to stop talking about that. But do we need to stop talking about that? Or is the uncomfortability of that conversation too much for you to handle? I'm going a bit off topic here, but this is something I feel particularly strong about at the point of recording, right? Is it something that needs to be changed directional? Is it uncomfortable for you not being centered in this conversation? Is it uncomfortable for you to not have that lens and perspective on the experiences that you believe are important? The reality is misogyny and sexism needs to still be discussed, because misogyny and sexism is still rampant, still present, still pertinent. Avoiding it, pretending like it doesn't exist, rationalizing and intellectualizing it in other directions doesn't address the uncomfortable. And that's what whataboutery seeks to do. It's not about criticality per se, it's about derailment. I need to derail your point because this is uncomfortable for me to listen to and experience. Name that. Sit with that uncomfortability. That for me is what the future of masculinity works looks like. Not being afraid to go, I can see that this is activating you, and I can see that you're trying to bring in different ideas and perspectives, but you're derailing the conversation right now. That's not disrespect. That's not hate. That's real communication. We can talk about this in another session or another part of the session for sure. But right now, this is the focus point. This is what's important. This is what we are focusing on at this point in time. But some spaces online and some narratives and some belief systems may have you as an educator thinking that if I do that, though, am I hating on boys? Am I not giving them space? No, we're focusing on something that's important, and there will be and can be time to explore other aspects and facets too. This is important to name. That for me is what the future of masculinity work must look like moving into the future. And hey, this next one, I have to really try and rein myself in because I can probably talk about this for hours. The future of masculinity work is a legacy focused, not knee jerk reactions. Like that for me is hugely important. When we're talking about current masculinity interventions and things that are happening right now, generally speaking, over the past 5 years, at least from my lens and my experience, is typically in response to culturally pervasive moments of time. A series comes out, a documentary comes out, something happens, and now we need to focus on this. It's knee jerk, it's reactive, it's not intentional, it's not designed and delivered with legacy in mind. As fast as we can move does not necessarily mean as fast as we can react. That for me is hugely important in this conversation. Intentionality supersedes speed, in my opinion, every single time. What is the focus of this work? Because if the focus is creating cultures where ideas of masculinity are reconsidered, contextualized, explored, examined, these things can't be done in 1 or 2 workshops. These things can't be done in a 45-minute session twice a month. These things can't be done just on the fly of, we've got, what, £500 left over in our budget? Let's bring someone in to talk about masculinity. Sorry, maybe that's a bit too. Maybe that's activated you. Maybe that's where you're at this point in time. And I don't mean to be so. If that came across as condescending or judgmental, that genuinely is not my intention. But what I think is really important is naming that. A lot of what we do in this space is actually in response to, oh my gosh, we need to do something. Let's do something. What should we do? Anything. Throw something at it and hope it sticks. The future of masculinity for work for me is intentional. It's focused. It's strategy driven and data informed, but not data reliant. Because you're young people in the cultural context of your schools, yes, they might share, presenting, they have similar presenting context to some of what the data suggests. But your school is not just a microcosm of wider culture, it's a microcosm of your area, your locality. There will be things that are unique in terms of how things are presented in the context of masculinity discourse, things that might be very similar in some spaces to some of your partner schools, but very different. Context is really important to consider in this conversation around future masculinities work. But I often see this reliance on data. The data suggests we go in this direction. I'll give you a very short anecdote from my personal experience. When I first started doing this work many, many years ago, what all of the data was alluding to is that there's a real body confidence issue with men and boys right now that needs to be addressed. There's a lot of articles coming out about it, lots of data coming out about it. This is something that's really important to be discussed in the context of masculinities in general. Right. For me, someone looking at the data, okay, I'm going to embed that into some of my deliveries. The first, the first deliveries that I did talking about body image, those sessions, the series that I did, bombed the hardest. Young people don't want to talk about body confidence. They can understand why it might be important to others, but they'd often come back to me and go, hey, Lewis, like, if I'm honest, like that was probably my least favorite session. It just didn't really speak to my experience. And that was a really valuable moment for me as a young professional in the space, recognizing that being data informed is important, but being data reliant is like, oh, the data says it, so I must embed it this way. Your young people are live, fluid, culturally, positioned young people that are the variants of culture. Not everybody's experiencing or approaching this conversation of masculinity in the same way. There is a plurality to masculinity that for me needs to be named. And that slower approach, that strategy, that considering what is the cultural context? How can we really attune to our own cultural context? How can we build that into some of the work that's valuable for the young people we're serving in this space? Is intentionally focused, longer term in its approach, and legacy focused. What do we want young people, for example, in the context of education, in our space, in our school, leaving school with when it comes to their ideas of masculinity, what it means to be a man in a space, what it means to be engaging with masculinities in wider cultural context? How does that look like from year 7, for example, music secretary is an example? What's it like from year 7 all the way through to year 11? What's the legacy of that moving forwards? That's what the future of masculinity what must look like for me as a professional in space, thinking about how we progress this moving forwards. For me, hugely important. And so when I think about this, when I consider all this in the space, these are some things that, off my head are things that I think are really important. there's lots more. I talk about some of those other aspects of my book, Masculinities in Schools. But my point is this: the future of masculinity work has to be attuned to the complexity of the conversation, but we mustn't be so afraid of dysregulation, challenge, or critique to the point where we avoid it. We must also not be so focused on the fast pacedness and the knee-jerk reactiveness to the point that we bypass intentionality. That for me, again, is hugely important. So if you're asking me what that future of masculinity looks like, that is what I think is particularly important moving forwards. So I hope you found this rant of mine useful. Around the 6 minute mark, I just went into some form of flow state, and I've looked at the clock now, and it's 15 minutes. So yeah, that is very much off the top of my head what I'm thinking at this point in time. I hope you found it useful, and if you are interested in, as I say, exploring some of my own lenses and how I write about this, I am plugging my book here. You know, there is some information in there that can be of use to you, and has helped many educators kind of approach these conversations. But there are also other people online and other professionals in the space that do speak to what I'm speaking about in different ways and different lenses, which I also think is really important to check out as well. One of the things that I am really keen on, as you probably know if you've tuned into a few episodes, this is my perspective, not the perspective. And I think what makes this area perhaps another sneak additional point into the future of masculinity work. The future of masculinity work needs to be collaborative and community focused from a range of different ideas and perspectives. Lewis Wedlock's way should not be, in my opinion, the way that masculinity work is approached. There are different voices, there are different expertise, there are different, cultural lenses, there are different lived experiences that can and must be shaped into this conversation. And I'm adding an extra one as well. I'm sorry, I wrapped up the episode, but I'm cooking in my brain again. The future of masculinity work, in addition to that, we're thinking about different experiences and ideas, also includes different gendered experiences. Future of masculinity work must include women and gender plural people. The future of masculinity work must include the ideas, the experiences, and the perspectives that challenge maybe some of our own lenses as men in the space and what we think men and boys need. We must be open to that, and we must be really recipient to those mirrors that are held to us in ways that challenge some of our own lenses. That for me is hugely important. I'm going to do a separate episode on this because I think, again, it's hugely important to discuss and think about in the space. But the future of masculinity work is not bound to, it should be only be men and boys or men in spaces designing and delivering these interventions. We should hear from a range of different lived experiences, a range of different professional experiences, and not sort of gatekeep this incredibly important body of work culturally, generationally, to the experience of just men being in space. Masculinity's work is not just bound to men. It is a range of gendered experiences who navigate and experience masculinity culturally, socially, that must be involved and must have their voices embedded into the work that follows. It's not just about Lewis says this and this has been doing this, or this professional says this because he's been doing this for a while. It's about recognizing the plurality of voices that shape and create the necessary attuned work that, in my opinion, has to really, be invested in moving into this next season and next chapter of this work. So I promise now that's the end. I just wanted to add that in. But yes, thank you so much for checking this out. I really appreciate you. I hope you find something useful in this episode, and I will catch you in a future episode very, very soon. Big, big blessings to you. See you soon.